This is Mark Maurer of The Real Deal. With me today is David Schechtman of Meridian Capital Group. David, thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Growing up, did you have any interest in real estate or law?
I had an interest in both. I somehow knew I was destined for law. I'm a bit of a pugilist and a fighter, so I knew that to me law was always a courtroom, advocating and fighting, and that's my earliest memory of having any vocational aspirations. Real estate really took shape while I was in law. My first memories of it were watching my father borrow money to buy a small building, which he holds today, almost 40 years later. But while I was in law, being a pugilist, I couldn't help but to take note of all the players in real estate and how happy they were and how much fun they were having. And I think that that was one of the greatest allures. I'd be lying if I didn't say that the potential to make more money was a very close second, if not first at the time. But it was definitely law first and real estate after.
So you started out your career practicing bankruptcy law at DLA Piper. What was that like for you? What was the breaking point at which you had enough and decided to go to the field?
So it was the summer of 2005. I was in Hope Hull, Alabama, in a fortified cinder block room at 10 or 11 o'clock at night doing due diligence for a bankruptcy. And I saw the account statement for a young real estate broker who was selling one of the assets through a 363 sale, which is essentially the mechanism by which property is sold out of bankruptcy. And that person made 3 times what I had made that year. That was probably the straw that broke the camel's back. I applied to be a real estate broker at my former firm just weeks later.
Mm-hmm. Are there certain skills from practicing law that benefit you, I assume, as a broker?
Yeah, I think a lot of people think about real estate brokers and they think, even in the commercial world, they can't communicate effectively in writing. Orally is something that many brokers have a gift for gab. I'm still a stickler for written communication and written follow-up. Email is wonderful, and we know that it's oftentimes legally binding, but nothing beats a FedExed or hand-delivered letter, and nothing beats a well-planned out itinerary for a conversation. Tomorrow I'm going to meet 6 or 7 family members who own a large portfolio here in the city, and it's time for a disposition. We have a 3-page agenda for that meeting. It's time management. And it no matter what your vocation is, better time management leads to better results.
In 2005, you joined Eastern Consolidated. Was that a big adjustment? Did you have to kind of realign your persona?
Sure. It was a staggering readjustment. Here I was in early 2005, becoming a 6th-year associate and having an automatic raise, a base salary of $185,000 plus bonus. I'm on the 30th floor of 1251 Avenue of the Americas at a fancy firm where you have a secretary, where you have people to do lots of things for you, and work flowed to you in part from the senior partners. Fast forward 6-8 months later, I'm sitting next to a 22-year-old and another gal in her early 20s. And I have a phone, and I have some senior people for whom I have to work, but nobody really cares about me, and I'm essentially making cold calls for a living with no salary, no health benefits, and I likely knew I'd be spending $10,000 to $20,000 in actual costs and trying to get my career started. So it was a sea change for me with a second child on the way, but I knew it's where I belonged even before I got there.
Mm-hmm. And you were there for about 10 years. How do you reflect on that period? What was a big lesson that you learned during that time?
First off, I reflect on it fondly. Dawn and Peter and Brian Ezrati are truly pillars of this industry since the mid-'80s. And I stay in contact with Brian. He happens to be a friend and a neighbor up in Westchester. That was a firm where you really learned to do things right.
And why did you and Lieberman and A.B. Casson jump ship for Meridian in 2015? And do you feel like you have some more autonomy there? What's the big difference between those two companies from your experience?
Investment sales brokers are certainly necessary, and we're a cog in the wheel in the 2 to 3% of all building stock that trades every year. But sales brokers, there's a lot of them, and sales brokers are asking to be engaged to do things. When people call up Meridian Capital for the past 25 to 30 years, they're in need, tremendous need of capital. They need money from the banks. The fact that Ralph has consistently been over 30, as much as 35, maybe 36 billion on debt and mortgage, and the market share that they have, not to mention the infrastructure which is in place. They had been doing investment sales for years, informally, all duly licensed and the right way, but they had been eclipsing what most firms were aspiring to do in an offhanded manner with investment sales. The fact that they were seeking to formalize it, and there was the opportunity for what I considered myself a couple of years ago, a B- guy in the city, to come in and to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ralph Hertzka and Helen Wang, who's a partner, and my team, where I had associates who candidly are going to zoom right past me, in my opinion. It was a no-brainer.
What's been one of the hardest types of deals to pull off recently in this market?
Retail. Oftentimes I'm a critic of the media. I think there's a herd mentality in media, which is unfortunate, but a lot of time it's true and it's accurate, but sometimes it's not. In this instance, it's not. Several years ago, the retail was the driver of value. Today, the upstairs is the driver of value, and whomever is bidding on the entire edifice is going to have to hypothecate. They're going to have to guess what the bottom is going to be. And it's such a wide array of guesses what the taking rents are going to be. So anything with a speculative or vacant component in retail poses, I'd say, not just it doesn't really pose a problem, but it's definitely a challenge.
Where have you seen pricing taper off?
Certainly in retail and garages. I will tell you today that I generally don't walk into pitches with a terribly rosy picture of what we believe vacant retail will be. We walk in with a practical and optimistic picture. But if you had asked me 36 months ago if I thought 5 caps would be trading in Manhattan for quasi-credit tenants, I would have said you're crazy. You're out of touch with Soho. Rents are only going up. And I believe that tremendously. You are seeing 4.5 and 5 caps in retail in Manhattan, which is something I didn't think I would see for many years.
How about for multifamily, though, maybe without a retail component? Where are you seeing pricing come down, like which neighborhoods?
I think multifamily is a building-by-building animal these days. Several years ago, we would say, wow, there's neighborhoods that are white-hot. And we do a ton in the boroughs, and all 5 boroughs, candidly. But we would tell you, go to Greenpoint, go to Red Hook for multifamily. If you can find scale, go to Bay Ridge, because we knew these were places that were ascending because they hadn't had growth for decades prior. Williamsburg is old hat. The CBD in downtown Brooklyn, old hat. Queens, Flushing, we've known about for a decade. So what we're seeing is we're starting to see a cooling off in the places that were overhyped. Williamsburg, I don't know that you're getting 20 plus times the gross rent anymore. I don't know that people are going to model rents above $70 a foot. But if you go to certain pockets of the Bronx, there's a ton of multifamily just on the other side of Hunts Point. There's a ton of room for growth.
Around late last year and early this year, investors and brokers in investment sales were saying like the market was picking up, and in some ways it seems like it has, but it also maybe has slowed down a little bit. Again, what's it going to take to get to 2015 levels? How far is that away?
I think so much of investment sales is driven by sentiment. We had a wonderful January. I know in investment sales we did about $120 million in hard contracts. So if you were to just push that out and say we would replicate that even 11 times, it would beat what we did last year. I did not enjoy February. It's not that it was quiet. We're fortunately very busy, but we didn't sign as many contracts and didn't book as much in commissions. I will tell you the past 6 to 7 weeks, there's been a marked uptick. And I think that the main driver, what's going to really drive volume more than anything else, is going to be seller realization. Sellers need to realize that rates are going to have a material effect across the board and across product types. Rates are still at historic lows, even though we're creeping into the fours materially for all product types. I think it's seller-driven more than buyer-driven.
What do you make of the move by commercial brokerages recently to consider going public? Newmark went public late last year with mixed results. Cushman is gearing up to do the same. There was talk a couple of years ago of Meridian potentially going public at some point. Is this a wise move right now?
I think the large service firms, and let's just agree that all these are all service firms, because the aforementioned all have several lines of business, as do we. They're analogous to the phenomenon of the early 2000s in the dot-com world for law firms. Law firms started to become very polarized. They were either very small in the early 2000s or very big. You have 5,000-6,000 person law firms. My wife works for one of them. I think that that's happening today in the real estate services world. You're going to have 4 or 5 public companies. But real estate is a very provincial business, extremely provincial. I guess the best way to explain it is if you get too big, you can't fit into small spaces. Trust me, I've gained 11 pounds in 3 years at Meridian. And that's going to happen to some of these firms. They're not going to be nimble enough. And by the way, small spaces doesn't mean small deals. But when you have 26 family members who command a $140 million empire, and you're a 5,000 person firm and you have to jump over a lot of hoops and a lot of rigmarole to get anything done and have 12 or 13 sign-offs, maybe I'd rather be with the firm that does the same amount of volume and it's nimble with a higher caliber of delivery.
You've honed the middle market business for several years. Occasionally you do a large $100 million, $200 million caliber deal, but why have you kind of largely stayed away from that space?
My average deal over 640 plus deals is about $39 million. I do a ton of 10 and 20s, and you're right. Each year, my group of 14 brokers does anywhere from 1 to 3 $100 million plus. And I think you folks may have written about a recent signing for $100 million. We're very comfortable in the 150 to 200 range, but candidly, there's much more activity. It's more lucrative below $100 million. And I can't believe I'm going to say this, much less say it on camera, but men and women of a certain age start to reflect on what they do for 70, 80 hours a week. I think I have more fun. I have such admiration for my partner and colleague Helen Wong and the Adam Spees of the world and selling their $2 billion buildings, but they're a little bit too paper-laden, and they're a little bit too data-driven, and there's oftentimes not as much leap of faith and sentiment and artistry and creativity as there may be in a $30 million development site in an up-and-coming neighborhood. It also takes a different skill set, and I intentionally left the 5,000 person law firm not to go back and work in one.
What do you think about some of like the Massey-Knackel Realty Services alumni leaving Cushman recently to start their own teams? Paul Massey to start his own business. James Nelson building a bigger team at Avis & Young. Does this create a window for you in the middle market space?
Sure. It most certainly does. The good news is I've been there already, and I'm very comfortable going toe-to-toe with all of these firms and winning out a more than fair share of assignments. But any disruption in the industry, and even when people blink for a moment, we're going to jump in there. The issue is so many of these folks are friendly competitors. I mean, some of the folks that you just mentioned, I was a staunch advocate for Paul, and James nominated me to a board position on which we both sit now, and we work side by side. Don't get me wrong. I would knock any of the aforementioned people down a flight of stairs to win an assignment, but with a smile, and we'd probably have a drink after.
One issue we've explored recently in commercial real estate is the wide gender gap of the city's 20 largest commercial brokerages. Recently, we found only 3 come close to having like an even split of male and female brokers. When we did this story in January, we reported that 120 of the 132 brokers at Meridian Capital Group were men. Is that something you see changing? Is this a problem?
It is changing, and it's changing naturally. As the spouse of a full-time professional, my wife's a lawyer at a large multinational firm. I'd like to believe I have some sensitivities to challenges, the gender divide and the battle that remains, especially since I met my wife when we were both just associates, and Karen was on the path to becoming a partner, and I watched Meridian, take a quick look at it, and when you talk about the low number of females, I think it's important to immediately look at one of the department heads for investment sales, Helen. Helen is wonderful, and she runs the department, and Helen has a really diverse team. I'm proud. Of my 16, 17 brokers, I have 1 female broker, but a lot of other female support staff. I'm glad that as technology continues to grow and enter the workplace for any vocation, and real estate in particular, which has historically been lagging, I think it's allowing for a lot more flexible work schedules, and that's going to bring some women who have historically embraced the traditional stay-at-home model back into the workforce, and that's great.
So you've been a supporter of Donald Trump's before and during his presidential run. You've also expressed some reservations. You said, I think in an interview with us just prior to the election, my reservations have been fortified by his campaign, especially of late. I'm absolutely aghast at some of the comments candidate Trump has made. Has your view on him changed?
Well, it changes, I think, every 13 to 14 minutes. Candidly, sometimes 8-minute intervals. I am oftentimes aghast at the tenor and the delivery of what's being said from the White House, but I remain a fervent supporter of the office of the President of the United States. That's a bit of a hedge, that answer. I still believe that there's great potential in the White House. I just wish it was done stylistically a lot differently.
Where do you stand on the recent moves to roll back the DoddFrank financial rules and the steel tariff decisions?
DoddFrank and Barney Frank and his cabal of legislators enacted what likely was necessary legislation to curtail some of what banks were doing in the best interest of the American public and those who couldn't defend themselves. The actual legislation that was put in place was such a draconian, overboard, Cro-Magnon-esque piece of legislation that it stymied free trade and commerce, and it shackled banks that had not only not done things wrong, were doing things right for the economy. I applaud the rollback, and I hope that there will be a much further rollback of this draconian and unnecessary legislation.
And how would you say the regulatory environment in the city has affected multifamily deals?
Well, a year or so ago or 2 years ago, I thought that it may not have the effect that it is. It is certainly giving people pause. But there's 2 things happening in the city that are having a tremendous effect. One is the legislation, and I think we have some over-legislation, although I applaud the mayor and the city for bringing back 421A, especially in the manner in which they brought it, even though it has some pimples on it. What do I think about the legislation that's been enacted with anti-tenant harassment and the proposed commercial rent regulation? I think that these are poorly designed, possibly well-intentioned, but horribly drafted pieces of legislation. It almost makes me want to go back and help them write it. I think the motivation from City Council to think about commercial rent regulation to spur activity, if that's truly the agenda, brilliant. Who wouldn't support that? But you can't do that by castigating owners. So I think it's well-meaning, but poorly drafted. Who wouldn't support anti-harassment of tenants? As a real estate broker, we want things done the right way. But to draft legislation that's so draconian that it's the burden of proof is on the landlord to prove that they haven't harassed. That flies in the face of the Constitution.
Who in real estate doesn't quite get your sense of humor?
I keep a very short list next to my gun rack. No, that's not true. I do not. But I'm sure I've irritated tons of people. Anybody who is pointed and terse and who has a modicum of intelligence and isn't afraid to say what the truth is, the truth will always irritate people.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. Anything that you want to discuss?
I don't think there's anything left to discuss other than everybody should be subscribing to The Real Deal. It's the Bible for everything real estate in New York.